Have you seen the Game Changers film yet? Last week we broke down the specific athletes, but now we're going to dive into the actual medical science of the film and determine were they actually telling the truth or is this just more propaganda? Let's dive in. Hi everyone, Floyd Meyer here. So in the film, the first medical professional that they actually interview is Dr. James Loomis, and he is the former team physician for both the St. Louis Rams and the St. Louis Cardinals. And he is talking about this myth that is very pervasive both in the athletic community as well as the general public, that you need to eat meat in order to have the energy to participate in some type of athletic event. So thinking like high intensity, short duration athletics, something like you're sprinting to first base, sprinting to catch a ball, something like that. And there is this myth that meat is what actually gives you the energy, but he breaks down this idea and actually discusses that it is your muscle glycogen that comes from carbohydrates that is actually going to give you the energy that you need in order to participate in these types of events. So I actually have to give the film some credit. This was a very accurate piece as far as I could tell. I could be nitpicking about, you can technically create these carbohydrates in your body from meat using this process called gluconeogenesis, but in general, they are correct that in order to operate at an optimal level, in order to have the highest athletic potential that you can, especially when we're talking about this short duration, high intensity exercise, you do need carbohydrates, and most of those are going to come from some type of a plant source. They then go on to talk about the myth that you need, in order to build big, strong muscles, you have to be taking in animal proteins. And yes, this is a myth. You can get the proteins to build big, strong muscles from plant sources. But unfortunately, they don't stop there. They start talking about some study where they were comparing plant eaters to omnivores, the people that eat meat. And they were saying that actually plant eaters get more protein in their diet than omnivores. And this is just complete nonsense. Regardless of if this study actually came up with those specific results or not, there's something called the healthy patient bias. And so people that are eating a plant-based diet are going to be much more health conscious in general. And so these people that are on this diet are going to be thinking more about how much protein they're actually taking in their diet. And so to compare them to the general population who doesn't spend more than 30 seconds a week thinking about what their macronutrient intake is per day, it's just not a fair comparison. If you actually looked at people who were equally obsessive about their diet and equally knowledgeable, I'm sure that the results would be very different. So animal products are going to be much more protein dense, meaning that in a smaller amount of food that you are eating, you are going to be getting more protein. And an easy comparison is if you look at an 8-ounce steak, you're going to be getting somewhere around 50 grams of protein in there. And that's pretty easy to eat. And in order to get the same amount of protein from a very high protein plant source like beans, if you look at black beans, you would need to eat 2 full cans of black beans in order to get the same amount of protein from that small piece of steak. And if you wanted to look at something like broccoli, which is constantly being touted as a quote-unquote protein powerhouse, if you look at these vegan pages online, you would need to eat about 20 full cups of broccoli to yourself in order to get the same amount of protein that's found in this steak. So when we're looking at protein density, yes, it is possible to get your protein completely from plant sources, but it's going to be more difficult. You're going to have to eat a higher volume of food, or you're going to need to get specific supplements like plant-based protein powders in order to get to your protein needs. The other thing that they break down in the film is what's called your amino acid ratios. So amino acids are going to be what make up proteins. You're going to have strings of these amino acids, you put them together, and that is a protein. And that's what is the building blocks for our body in order to build muscle, build tissue, all of those things. And so if you look at animal products, they are going to have a more balanced amino acid ratio, meaning they have all of the essential amino acids in the right proportions that you would need in order to, build muscle, do all of the things that we need to do. Plants do have the same essential amino acids, but they are not in the correct ratio. So there are certain amino acids that most plant foods are going to be very low in. And so it becomes much more difficult to get that balanced amino acid ratio if you are eating a completely plant-based diet, unless you are extremely diligent in your diet and you know exactly what you're doing. So a lot of these athletes in this film, they do fantastic on this plant-based diet, but these are elite athletes. So these people are focusing a large amount of time on their diet to try and get the correct amount of these amino acids, the correct amount of protein. A lot of these people have dietitians that are specifically planning out these meals for them. So for the general public, it's actually quite difficult in order to get the correct amino acid ratios, and versus just eating some type of an animal product where you're going to not have to think about it. So yes, you do not need to eat animal products in order to both get enough protein in your diet or in order to get the right amino acid ratios, but it does make it more difficult, and so you need to be very diligent if you are going to try and be on a plant-based diet. Now that we have the basic nutrition science out of the way, let's talk about inflammation. So they start to talk about inflammation in the film, and they are talking about that the plant-based diet is an extremely powerful way to decrease levels of inflammation. They say a bunch of things like, protein products are going to be inherently inflammatory, and they're packaged in all of these inflammatory chemicals are in them, and plant-based proteins are very, very anti-inflammatory. But what they really leave out in the film, and this is super, super important, is that most of the decreases in inflammation that you see when people go on a plant-based diet are due to weight loss alone. So if you lose weight, you will decrease your overall levels of inflammation. And that can be easily measured in the blood. And that's why people feel better when they lose weight on all kinds of different diets, from vegan diets to carnivore diets. If you lose weight, you will decrease your inflammation levels, and then you can end up feeling better. So it's unfortunate that they end up going so far in this film as to say that, all animal proteins are inherently inflammatory, and if you eat them, you are going to screw up your microbiome, and your whole body is going to become inflamed as a result. If you do the actual controlled experiments where you have people eating an appropriate amount of total calories, and especially if they get lean animal products, you don't see the same levels of inflammation that are associated with something like just eating a hamburger, or when you test omnivores in general, people that are overeating on the total calories and they're eating these animal products that are high in saturated fat. Yes, you will see higher levels of inflammation, but you can eat animal products and control your overall inflammation levels, and that's something that they just do not discuss in the film. Now we get to heart disease, and this is an incredibly complicated discussion. Heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States, and unfortunately, in the film, the main character, his father actually ended up having a heart attack, which luckily he went to the hospital and got a stent placed, so he was okay. But that really got them talking to all of these different cardiologists. And the first one they talked with was Dr. Ornish, he's world renowned in his treatment of heart disease. He has a very successful clinic that has documented the reversal of heart disease and the decreasing of the risks of heart disease using a plant-based diet, but they also use a complete lifestyle change protocol. And they also start talking with multiple different other cardiologists and researchers, and most of these people have they've either written books or they have some type of products that they're selling that are going to be based off of going plant-based. And so there is some bias in there that they didn't talk about that in the film, but all of these people, they make some pretty radical claims, and one of the claims that they make is that when you eat animal products, you form plaques in your arteries, and they just leave it at that. And when people are making claims like that, bold claims like that, you should really question, the legitimacy of it. Not every time you eat meat are you inherently putting plaque in your arteries. It's more complicated than that. If you look at who has heart attacks and who doesn't have heart attacks, there obviously is going to be a decreased risk of people having heart attacks if they are on some type of a vegetarian and vegan diet. But again, that healthy patient bias that we were talking about earlier, these people that are on these diets are going to be focusing much more on a lot of other things. They're going to be focusing more on their sleep, more on their exercise. They're not going to be smoking. All of these other things are going to be decreased, which again is going to decrease their overall risk of having a heart attack. There are a lot of omnivores, that people that eat meat that do not have heart attacks, and there are plenty of vegans and vegetarians that do have heart attacks. So, if you want to see, I don't want to go much more into this. If you want to see how complicated this can get, go and watch the Joe Rogan Experience. They had a debate about heart disease and saturated fat, and these two scientists, I think one of them was a naturopathic doctor and one of them was an MD. They argued for about 3 hours on this topic, and they basically got nowhere. So that's really all I want to go into it, but there is more to heart disease than just being on a plant-based diet and not eating any meat. Also, despite what the film says, there are other diets that have been shown to decrease your risk of heart disease. In the film, they say the only thing that's ever been shown to do that is the vegan or plant-based diet, and that's just not true. The Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet have both been shown to decrease your risk of heart disease, as well as decreasing all of the risk factors associated with like obesity and all kind of type 2 diabetes, all of these other things. So there are other diets out there, and to say that the only way to decrease your risk of these diseases is to be entirely plant-based is just not accurate. So in summary, there are two main points that I believe were well portrayed in this film. The first is that meat does not give you energy. That energy, especially when we are talking about high intensity, short duration exercise like you would think of for most athletic pursuits, that is going to come from muscle glycogen, which is going to come from carbohydrates that you eat. Most of the carbohydrates are going to come from plant-based sources. So the energy that you use in order to do any type of athletic event most likely is going to come from carbohydrates. So that was an accurate point. The second point is that you do not need to get all of your protein from animal sources or any of your protein from animal sources. You can get enough protein from plant-based sources in order to build lean, strong muscle. You can become pretty jacked eating a plant-based diet. But you have to be extremely diligent with this. It's difficult to get the correct ratios of amino acids in your diet unless you know exactly what you're doing. So if you are a dietitian, then yes, you can probably do this pretty simply, or if you have worked with some type of a dietitian, yes, you can do it, but it takes work. And if you are some type of an athlete that has a very high requirement for protein, you are going to almost definitely need to have some type of a supplement, protein supplement, that has already done the work for you, where they have already combined the correct types of plant-based proteins to get the correct ratio of amino acids. So both of those points were well portrayed. Now, it's really important to point out that nutrition science is inherently difficult to do. Most of the information that we get is based off of epidemiological evidence from patient surveys where patients are trying to recall what they ate, days, weeks, months prior, and that is just going to be inherently inaccurate. So whenever you hear people saying things that are, cut and dry, black and white, things like animal protein, every time you eat it, causes plaque in your arteries, or if you eat any type of animal products, you are going to get heart disease, cancer, and erectile dysfunction. Anytime someone says something like that, that should really raise some red flags. This stuff is complicated. We haven't done the studies where we have looked at how different foods are going to affect people in the long run. We've never done the study where we've looked at every food that someone has eaten throughout their life and seen how that is going to actually impact their health overall their health and their longevity. So you got to take all of this stuff with a grain of salt, and there is a lot of nuance. There's a lot of variability in between people. Some diets agree with people, some diets don't agree with people. And so you need to always look at these things with some sort of a nuance and try and avoid these black and white answers. All in all, I really did enjoy this film. They did a good job of showcasing these different athletes. I wish they had spent more time doing that, though. I wish they had spent more time showing these athletes performing at a high level and showing us exactly what do they actually eat in a day. You know, like the powerlifter, how many protein drinks does he eat in a day? Is it 4 or 5? Because it has to be a lot of different protein drinks, because to get the amount of protein that you would need in order to build that amount of muscle would be extremely high, and you just cannot get that from eating beans. You'd be eating like 7 cans of beans a day. It just becomes undoable. You just can't do that when you're eating these, so you have to supplement. So I wish that they had spent more time doing that, and they had spent less time demonizing all animal proteins, saying that if you eat animal proteins that you're going to get heart disease and cancer and erectile dysfunction, because that is just not true. Most of those diseases are due to excess calories in general, regardless of where you're coming from. You can become very overweight and obese and have heart disease even eating a vegan or vegetarian diet. So all in all, it was good, but they did have a lot of bias that I wish that they had, tried to control more for. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I hope that this has been helpful. If you want to learn more about inflammation in general, I've made multiple videos on that in the past, so make sure you guys go check those out. Make sure you guys are subscribing and following so you don't miss out on any more great content. So again, this is Floyd Meyer reminding you to eat better so that you can do more.